Brother Warney said there were a lot of you, but I didn't expect quite this many. Well, you're welcome to our house. I hope you're not too squashed in. I trust you've been enjoying Oxford. It's a wonderful city. I don't get in as much as I would like, because these pins aren't quite what they used to be. But when I do, I very much enjoy it. By the way, if you have a chance to walk through Headington, our little village, I think you'll enjoy it. It's like most villages, it has its charms. So, you're all writers, are you? And scholars. Oh dear. One feels a little unnerved. It's almost like being a lion in a den of Daniels. And you're all from America. I must say, without my American readers, my success as an author would be somewhat diminished. What do they say? A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. I think that applies to authors as well, especially in this city. Now, I tell you what, it reminds me of a little ditty I once read. I hope I can remember it. Wee Lewis is burnt out quickly, I'm afraid. I think it goes something like this. An author from Merrow was a very odd fellow. He only could write in a tub. With waterproof ink and steaming hot drink, he would write till he needed some grub. When he bathed in red wine, he wrote words of rhyme and sent them to ladies of fame. But these ladies of note forgot what he wrote and couldn't remember his name. When he bathed in hot tea, he wrote mystery and sent them to New Scotland Yard. But these words of intrigue were hard to believe, and they sued him for dubious yarns. When he bathed in cow's milk, his words were like silk, and he sent them to men of the cloth. But these gossamer notes were fed to the goats, and they all developed a cough. When he bathed in neat gin, he wrote with a grin, and sent them to jesters and clowns. But these voluble puns were easy to shun, for not one could vanquish a frown. When he bathed in pea soup, his words were astute, and he sent them to those of sharp wit. But these words for the wise were quickly despised, being seen as the work of a twit. One day in his tub he started to blub, for all of his writings were spurned. His friends even said, "Your writings we dread. 'Twould be best if they all should be burned." So this author in vain then boarded a plane and flew to a land far away. But in this new land, his writings seemed grand. 3 cheers for the US of A. You won't mind if I use this chair, do you? It's a little farther back. I'm going to bring it up. Warney's always moving the chairs, you know. That's better. Of course, I want to be able to see you. My health is not what it was, but I do feel a little invigorated today, so I'm very glad of your company. A little while ago, I had a heart attack, and I was very convinced at the time that I was about to enter in, as they say. But as you can see, my entrance was postponed. I can't help feeling that it was rather a pity I did survive. I mean, having glided so painlessly up to the gate, to have it shut in one's face seems a little hard. Especially knowing that someday the whole process must be gone through again, and perhaps a little less pleasantly. Though they call Stephen the first martyr, I sometimes think that Lazarus had the raw ordeal. Now, you won't mind if I indulge in a cup of tea, will you? I find that tea keeps me going. I feel a little bad because I'd hoped Warney would be here to make you a cup of tea before we got started. Unfortunately, he had to pop out quite suddenly. I say suddenly. His departure seemed to coincide with the arrival of your bus. But hopefully, if he gets back, we'll rustle you up a cup of tea, and we'll send you on your way rejoicing, won't we? You Americans drink iced tea, don't you? How strange. Still, I suppose that dates back to your first big tea party. You dumped it in cold water then, and you've been doing it ever since. By the way, Professor Tolkien tells me that he very much enjoyed his luncheon with you. Said it was one of the highlights of his calendar year. Well done. The professor is not an easy man to impress. I should know. Don't get me wrong. We have been friends for many, many years now. Indeed, he and I, along with a few other writers, used to meet quite regularly. Men splendid among men, as Charles used to say. We called our little band the Inklings, and our chief occupation was to read to one another manuscripts that were works in progress. If I'm not mistaken, Tollers, that's what the professor is called in the inner sanctum, Tollers read the whole of The Lord of the Rings to us long before it was ever published. What a book. In its mounting levels of grandeur and terror, I judged it almost unequal in the whole range of narrative art. A man's fertility of imagination never ceases to amaze me. I remember one day I was working on a manuscript that I was particularly keen to read to Tollers. I was feeling unusually positive about it. I think that should have been the first warning sign. After I'd read the first few chapters, there was a stony silence, and Tollers was sat there rubbing his chin. "Jack," he said, "I dislike it intensely. It really won't do, you know. Why don't you put your efforts into something more worthwhile?" Professor's not a man to mince words. Well, after such stinging censure, I shelved the project to get on to something more worthwhile. Sometimes later, I was going through some old papers. You're all writers, aren't you? Do you tend to find that you accumulate papers? I do. And then the pile builds up to the point where I can't find anything I really want to find. Well, I've managed to solve this problem. You see, we never have enough paper to light our fires with in the winter. So every now and then I go through this pile and pull out obsolete papers, and I pull out half-finished manuscripts that I'm not going to complete, or Tollers doesn't want me to complete, and then I throw them in the fire paper basket. Indeed, when I have a book published, I usually do exactly the same with the original manuscript. Charles rather scurrilously says that I should save these manuscripts for posterity, to which I reply that posterity has been blamed for far too many things already. Anyway, in this particular clear-out session, I came across the manuscript that Tollers had so roundly condemned. And I was just about to throw it away, and I thought, well, I'll give it a read. I can't do any harm. Do you know, I was enthralled, even though I'd written it myself. So I thought, I'm going to finish it, even though I will probably incur the wrath of my illustrious colleague, and that's exactly what I did. I sent it to my publisher, and he was so enthusiastic he rushed it to the presses. And I'm very glad to say that 13 years later, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is still in print. Now, it is my usual custom, when I have a book published, to send a first edition copy to Tollers. But I decided not to do it this time. I didn't want him to think that I was making a point, so you won't find it on his bookshelves, I don't think, nor, for that matter, will you find it on the bookshelves of many of my illustrious Oxford colleagues. I think they regard my children's books as a betrayal of my position as an Oxford Don. I'm quite sure they regard my Christian books as a betrayal of my position as an Oxford intellectual. Not that I consider myself an intellectual. My wife was a little more blunt. Jack, she once said, the way you and your Oxford cronies sometimes pontificate, anyone would think that if you were all drowned at sea, the world would grind to a halt. Personally, my sympathies would be with the fish. I think when I accepted a professorship at Cambridge, there was a quiet jubilation amongst many of Oxford's elite. They thought I would be packing my bags and leaving town. But as I could easily commute to Cambridge, I had absolutely no intention of leaving the city I'd lived in or near for the last 30 years. So we didn't move. And here we are, still at the kilns. I often wonder what will happen to it when Warnie and I are gone. Judging by the number of tourists in this town, probably it will be bought by some Americans, I should think. Well, it'll serve them right. When they move the bookcases, the walls will fall down. By the way, I say we didn't move and we lived here. I'm, of course, referring to my brother and I. My wife died 3 years ago. It's funny, really. When we were very young, Warnie and I used to spend a lot of time on our own. Now that the twilight years have rolled in, we find ourselves on our own again. And still, I might say, content with our own company. I don't know whether I should let you into a little secret. Warnie would be horrified. But as he's gone AWOL, he can hardly argue the point, can he? I sometimes call him BPB. He sometimes calls me SPB. SPB stands for Small Piggy Bottom. So I think you can deduce what BPB stands for. That's what our nurse Lizzie Endicott called us when we were young. Precisely what inspired her to so name us, I'm sure I can leave to your own fertile imaginations. Suffice it to say, the tradition remains till this day. Oh, not in public, you understand. Would hardly add to our reputation as if, when I was with the bank manager, I asked him whether Big Piggy Bottom needed to sign the document as well. I'm sure some people would say it's childish. I think we see it as a celebration of a relationship. No doubt the practice will continue till the day we die. I've told Warnie that if he goes first, I know what I'm going to inscribe on his gravestone. Here lies Warnie, brother dear, who couldn't say no to a glass of beer. Here lies Warnie, soldier brave, who beat his brother to this grave. Here lies Warnie, he'll ne'er be forgotten, not with a name like Big Piggy Bottom. Warnie and I were allies from the start. And when we moved to our new house, our large house, just outside of Belfast, we were in our element. Seemed more like a city than a house. If the story of Clive Staples Lewis is ever written, and God forbid that posterity should once again be so lumbered, I think this house would feature as a major character. I'm a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, indoor upstairs silences, attics to be explored in solitude, and endless books. I always had as much certainty of finding a new book in our house as a man has of finding a fresh blade of grass in a lush green meadow. One day I was thumbing through a book of poetry by Longfellow, and I came across these words. I heard a voice that cried, "Balder the Beautiful is dead, dead." I had never even heard of Balder, yet these words brought on an extraordinary mystical feeling, a notion of great cold expanses of northern sky. I couldn't say exactly what I felt, only that it was a sense of exhilarating joy, and the more I tried to recapture the initial sensation, the more it slipped away. I think as a child I was very precocious. I once remember walking into my parents, I think I was only 4 years old at the time, and saying that I did not like Clive, much less did I like Staples, and that I would only answer to the name of Jaxie. And from that time on, I was known as Jaxie Lewis, which was later modified to Jack. When I was 6 years old, Mother took Warnie and I to France for a short holiday. Father didn't come. Father was a man married to daily routine, so holidays were anathema to him. Anyway, when we got back, I happened to bump into Father in the living room. "Oh, hello, Jack," he said. "How do you like France?" I said, "Well, I like it very much, Father, though I find I have a prejudice against the French." "Oh, really?" he said. "Why is that?" I said, "Father, if I knew that, it wouldn't be a prejudice, would it?" It's one of the first times I ever saw him speechless. Mother just burst into laughter. She had a laugh that could inspire 1,000 laughs. Mother was our rock, our fortress, almost the sole architect of our humdrum happiness. So when she died with cancer, it was the end of my world. The long corridors became long, empty corridors. The empty, sunlit rooms became rooms blackened by the heavy drapes that were drawn across the windows. The upstairs indoor silences gave way to the cheerless sounds of weeping and lifeless dialogue. And the attics to be explored in solitude became attics to cry in solitude. Our rock had sunk into the sea like Atlantis. Our fortress had crumbled. The laughter had been silenced. And I was 10 years old. Not long after Mother died, I was forced to leave my beloved house. Oh, not because Father was selling it, but because I was being sent to boarding school in England. Can you imagine the desolation of a 10-year-old boy who has been stripped of much of what he holds dear and then finds himself traveling to a foreign and foreboding land? Fortunately, Warnie was with me. I remember that it was a very rough sea crossing. Warnie was seasick. Absurdly, I rather envied this achievement and spent the rest of the journey trying to replicate it myself. And when I did manage it, it was a very poor affair. Apparently, I'm a very good sailor. Our destination was a little town 20 miles north of London, of which the principal establishment was Wynard Boarding School, the school to which we were being sent. Now, use your imaginations. It is September 1908, and there is a young boy standing at the classroom door. He is sweating and itching thanks to the thick, dark, woolly clothes he is wearing. He is being throttled by a highly starched white collar. His feet are already aching in unaccustomed boots, and he is wearing knickerbockers buttoned up to the knee. Worst of all is a bowler hat, apparently made of iron, which grips his head. That was me. And I remember thinking then that if prison uniforms were anything like this, then I would remain a model citizen for the rest of my life. Wynard was a small school, 20 or so boarders. Thus, the teaching staff consisted of the proprietor and the headmaster. We called him Oldie, and his brow-beaten son, Wee Wee. Now, quite how he came to be named Wee Wee, one can only surmise. The in-joke amongst the boarders was that when he was being dressed for his christening, his infant baptism, someone forgot to put his nappy on. I think you call it a diaper. And then when he was being held over the font and felt water on his head, it started the waterworks at the other end, and the vicar said the first thing that came into his mind. Oldie lived in a solitude of power. like the sea captains in the days of sail. And he revelled in cruelty. I have known Oldie many times come into a room, stand there, and his eyes would go to and fro, ravenously looking for some poor soul to settle on. And then when he found somebody, he would say, "Oh, there you are, Rez, you horrid little boy. If I don't feel too tired this afternoon, I shall give you a good drubbing." Despite all this cruelty, we did surprisingly little work. I think there was only one good thing that befell me at Wynard. It was there that I first began to seriously read my Bible and to pray. Intellectually, however, my time at Oldie's was almost entirely wasted. Had the school not closed down and had I remained there for another 2 years, I think my fate as a scholar would have been sealed for good. But it was closed down after an investigation following an incident when a boy was viciously beaten by Oldie. Do you know, not long after that, Oldie was certified insane. Well, from the tyranny of Wynard, I went for a short while to a preparatory school and then off to Malvern College in England, another boarding school where a different form of tyranny reigned, prefects who lost no opportunity in venting their spite against the new boys. But despite all this, it was at Malvern that my education really began, and it was also at Malvern that I retreated from whatever belief I had in Christianity. And so little by little, with fluctuations I cannot now trace, I became an atheist, dropping my so-called faith with no real sense of loss, and I might say a good deal of relief. Of course, like so many atheists, I was living in a world of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist, but I was very angry with him for not existing. I once remember another little ditty. It's a bit silly, but it does sum up my situation. I hope I can remember it. One day I'm going to get caught out. Some say there is a being, divine or otherwise, who made the sun, the moon, the earth, and all the host of stars. A being who made man and beast, the greatest to the very least. He spoke with might, and there was light. One word, and there was Mars. Some say that it's not so. There is no architect. The universe and all we see is all just there by chance. That man and beast are all the same, soulless creatures with different names. There is no why. We live and die. Life's just a fleeting dance. I find I'm in a quandary. The more I look, the less I see. I say, oh well, it's hard to tell. Thank God that I'm an atheist. You'll get it. Well, if Malvern College saw my decline into youthful atheism, my arrival at the great Knox house heralded a season in which that atheism found a willing mentor. The great Knock was a tutor to whom my father sent me in Great Bookham in Surrey, which is in the south of England. His full name was W.T. Kirkpatrick. I called him the Great Knock, and he was an Ulsterman with an intellect built on fierce logic. The only illogical behavior I ever saw him indulge in was when on Sundays he put on his best suit to dig the garden. I shall never forget the first time I met him. He had collected me from the railway station, and we were traveling to his home in his car, and I happened to say that I thought the scenery in Surrey was much wilder than I'd expected. "Stop," said the Great Knock as the car screeched to a halt. "What do you mean by wildness, and what grounds did you have for not expecting it?" Well, as answer upon answer was rejected, it soon became apparent that I had no clear idea corresponding to the word wildness, and insofar as I had any idea at all, wildness was a singularly inept word. "Do you not see, then," concluded the Great Knock, that your remark was meaningless? One was even afraid to say yes. I often wish I could have been a fly on the wall when he was talking to his wife. Oh, hello, dear. You're home early. I hadn't expected you so soon. Stop, woman! What do you mean by early? And what grounds did you have for not expecting me so soon? Well, I grew very fond of the great Knock, and I owe him a debt I can never repay. You see, my father had sent me to him to prepare me for the entrance examinations into Oxford University, and in that he was very successful. Thanks to his teaching skills, I won a scholarship to University College, Oxford. And I took up my studies there in 1916. Of course, I had to lay them down in 1970 when I was drafted into the army to play my part in the First World War. But my army career wasn't very distinguished. As soon as I arrived at the front lines in France, I was hospitalized with trench fever. Thereafter, I was only ever in serious danger twice. Once when an enemy shell exploded by one of our latrines. Unfortunately, I was in residence at the time, which meant for a hasty evacuation. Well, that's an unfortunate choice of words, isn't it? The other time was when a shell burst behind our front lines. It was an English shell, what they call friendly fire. Well, now there's a contradiction in terms. You all right, Bill? No, that blasted German shell just blew my leg off. It wasn't a German shell, Bill, it was an English one. Oh, well, that's all right then, isn't it? Well, it was a friendly shell, that English shell. For me, anyway. Though I received superficial flesh wounds, they were enough to have me sent back to England, and by the time I had recovered, the war was over. I still have a relic up here, a little bit of shrapnel that's still there. The doctors thought it was too close to the heart to mess around with, and they said it wouldn't do any harm. So if any of you have got any magnets, don't get them out, as you might find I'm rather drawn to you. Well, I took up my studies again at University College, and by that time, of course, I had a love of philosophy and English language, and all my studies were weighted in that direction. And I passed the various examinations with sufficient distinction to allow me to bide my time in Oxford to await, hopefully, a suitable appointment. And in May the 22nd, I think it was, 1925, I leapt out of bed and rushed to the front door to collect the Times newspaper in which was published the announcement I had been waiting for so long. The President and Fellows of Magdalen College, Oxford, have appointed to an official fellowship in the college as tutor of English language and literature, Mr. Clive Staples Lewis. And that's where, for the next 30 years, I tutored my students. It's during that time I wrote most of my books. Now I can see what you're thinking. Oh, here it comes. A tedious bibliography. Well, you'll be pleased to know that I am not going to indulge in that questionable practice of telling you what I wrote and why I wrote it. I will say this, though. I was very glad that my general outlook on life changed before I wrote most of my books. Otherwise, some of them I would have had to rewrite, and others I would never have written at all. You see, by my early 30s, I had not only abandoned my atheistic philosophy, I had come to see it as an utterly vacuous doctrine. Mind you, I wasn't yet ready to accept Christianity, much less the concept of a perfect being sacrificing himself for a mass of imperfect beings. I had somewhat begrudgingly come to the conclusion that some sort of God was the least objectionable theory, but I still viewed God as a rather crude, nursery-like word, and so I resorted to referring to fundamental truth as a spirit, while at the same time maintaining there was absolutely no possibility of having a personal relationship with this spirit. Unfortunately, this so-called spirit began to show an alarming tendency to do what I said it couldn't do. Become personal. Worse still, it seemed to be taking up the offensive. I remember I was going up Headington Hill on a bus, and I was aware of a sensation in which I was holding something at bay, as though I was shutting something out. And I realized there was a choice: to open the door or to shut it. A little while later, only moments later, I realized I had made that choice. I had opened the door. And I finally admitted that God was God. That night I knelt down and prayed for the first time in a long time, probably the most reluctant and maybe even dejected supplicator in all of England. But though I had admitted that God was God, I hadn't yet admitted that Christ was Christ. However, I did say that the Spirit was on the offensive. One night, I invited Tollers and a man named Hugo Dyson to dine with me at Magdalen. Dyson is a philosopher. He's a devoutly religious man, and he has a love of the truth. He's also a man that gives you the impression of being made of quicksilver. Now, I mean this in the positive sense. He pours himself into a room in a cataract of words and gestures, and you are caught up in the stream. After the first plunge, it's exhilarating. Well, after we had dined, we took a walk through the Magdalen grounds, and I happened to remark to Tollers that I still viewed the story of Christ as just another myth. Well, that set Tollers off. Jack, he said, in a way I agree with you. As you know, I believe that all mythology contains some fragments of eternal truth. But the story of Christ is fundamentally different. You see, the poet who invented this myth was God himself. And the whole myth is absolute truth, and the myth actually happened at a precise point in human history. Well, I said, Tollers, that's a little hard to accept. Jack, he said, you amaze me. He said, when you meet sacrifice in a pagan story, you don't mind it at all. In fact, you rather like it. You only dislike it when you meet it in the Gospels. He was right, of course. And I did love the story of Balder. And he said, why can't you transfer your appreciation of that story to the story of Christ, the life and death of Christ? Well, by the time Tollers had finished, it was 3 a.m. in the morning. And so he left. And then the second phase of the offensive kicked in. Hugo Dyson, who spent the next hour telling me how he'd become a Christian and how important his relationship with Jesus Christ was. Tollers left me at 4 a.m. and my mind was in a whirl. So many thoughts rushing through. And then I realized it had come to a point where it was a matter of belief, not logical proof. I also realized that for far too long I had let my rational side dominate my emotions. Not long after that, I went from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ. I came to see that God became man for no other purpose than to secure man's salvation. The centerpiece of Christianity is the story of that one grand miracle, that he who is beyond space and time, who is uncreated, eternal, came into nature, came into human nature, descended into his own universe, died and rose, bringing up nature with him. And now that I had come to this point, I was determined to accept the traditional doctrines of Christianity. I did not want to argue about them. I did not want to reinterpret them. I simply wanted to defend them. And that's why I wrote most of my books. To the extent that some people have dubbed me rather dubiously, I think, as a Christian apologist. I must say the term sits very uneasily on my shoulders. Indeed, there are many times when I feel very much unlike a Christian apologist. Not like a Christian apologist at all. Probably more like an apology for a Christian. Anyway, I always find that apologetic work is somewhat dangerous to one's own faith. Sometimes a doctrine never seems dimmer to me than when I've just successfully defended it. And that's when I repair to the apologist's prayer. From all my lame defeats and oh much more, from all the victories I seem to score, from cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which, while angels weep, the audience laugh. From all my proofs of thy divinity, thou, who dost need no proof, deliver me. The one thing I was determined when I became a Christian, that unlike my childhood version, this should be no wishy-washy affair. It shouldn't be only on Sundays. Putting on Christ is not a special exercise that one does on a special day. It is the whole of Christianity. Christianity offers nothing else at all. I am sometimes intrigued by people who want to use Christianity as a convenience. Do you know that in World War II, the churches, which had been previously half empty, were so full on Sundays that you could hardly get a seat? People choosing to believe because it suits them, Charles used to say. We've all been guilty of that, Jack. Dear Charles. When he descended on Oxford, it was with such commentary blaze. Charles Williams, a man whose lectures were so celebrated that you could hardly get a seat there as well. Lectures delivered without a single note, perfectly coherent, and delightfully peppered with quotations in his incantatory manner. I shall never forget a lecture that he gave on chastity. Simply as criticism, it was superb. For here was a man who cared with every fiber of his being for that serious doctrine of virginity. It was a beautiful sight to see a room full of young men and young women spellbound, sitting in that absolute silence that cannot be faked. I had at last, if only for once, seen a university doing what it was intended to do and founded to do, teaching wisdom. Speaking of World War II and the increased interest in Christianity, even the BBC got in on the act. They asked me if I would do a series of talks on the basics of Christianity. They even said they thought it might help boost morale. Well, I agreed, and the first series that I did I felt were a complete failure. But I consoled myself with the fact that I wasn't the first ass that God had used, and probably wouldn't be the last. I did 3 series in all, and no one, certainly not I, realized how popular they would become. Oh, whether they boosted the British morale, I cannot say. I do know this, that my publisher urged me to edit them into a book. It's ironic, really. But for the Second World War, I doubt that Mere Christianity would have ever been published. Oh, now I can see what you're thinking. You're thinking, this author is not to be trusted. He said he wasn't going to speak about his books or how he wrote them. Well, now that I've transgressed, I might as well do it again. During World War II, we were constantly bombarded with German propaganda broadcasts that cut through our regular programming. Couldn't do anything about it. And one day, one of these propaganda broadcasts came through, and it was Hitler. And I jumped up to turn it off, obviously. And as I got to the radio, I stopped. I was stunned by the power of his oratory. It was compelling. Of course, I did turn it off in the end. The next Sunday, I was coming out of church, and I was reflecting on this incident and the fact that we as Christians face a very compelling enemy. And then it struck me. I came up with an idea to write a book that would look at the psychology of temptation only from the other point of view. And that book was called The Screwtape Letters. And it went on to be one of my most successful books ever. Do you know what? It even landed me on the front cover of Time magazine. September 1947. Did any of you see it? No? Oh, well, you haven't missed much. Charles, by the way, was asked to write a review on Screwtape in one of the magazines. I forget which one. I won't tell you whether he wrote good or ill of it. I will tell you how he finished his review. It went like this. Dear Scorpuscle, I hate this book, this heavenly book. It's heavenly dangerous. This giveaway of hell. Your friend, Snicksozzle. P.S. You will send someone to see after Lewis, some very clever fiend. Oh, by the way, when I read the first few chapters of Screwtape to Tollers, he was very unenthusiastic. He thought I was playing with fire, but I was determined that he should read it all. But how could this be achieved? Tollers can be a very stubborn man if he wants to. And then it struck me. I know how I can get him to read it. I'll dedicate the book to him. Well, I want to go and see if I can find Warney. I want to make a cup of tea for you, and I think he might be at Richard's, so I'm going to go and give a quick call. While I'm gone, why don't you stretch your legs? You'll find some conveniences around. I think you call them restrooms. How odd. I can't think of any room least likely to afford a good rest. Well, if you give me a couple of minutes, I'll be back in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Anybody seen Warney? Well, I phoned Richard and he's not there. I don't know where he could have got to. I know where he's gone to. He's always doing this on me. He stopped off at the pub for a pint of beer. I have to watch him, you know. Sometimes rather overdoes it. But I think he's a little better now that he's recognized that he's got a problem. There's a self-deprecating air about it. He's always trotting out this little poem. Quite humorous, I always think. And I don't know whether I can remember it. I'll do my best. How does it go now? 'Twas an evening in November, as I very well remember. I was walking down the street in drunken pride. My knees were all aflutter, so I lay down in the gutter. And a pig came up and lay down by my side. As I lay there in the gutter, thinking thoughts I ought not utter, a lady passing by was heard to say, "You can tell a man who boozes by the company he chooses." And the pig got up and slowly walked away. Don't tell Warney I told you, will you? It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry BPB. Well, I've told you a little bit about my childhood. Told you a little bit about my education. Told you a little bit of how I became a Christian. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my wife. As I say, she died 3 years ago. But first we must go back to 1950, the year that The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe was published. I've always received a lot of correspondence from people who have read my books, and I always make a point to answer every one of them. Warney helps me in this endeavor. He can use a typewriter, I can't. Even if I could, I would stick to handwriting. I think it's far more personal. Still, I suppose typewriters are here to stay. Anyway, one day we had an unusually large postbag, and partly because there were a lot of letters from America. So I said, well, Warner, you take the English ones and I'll take the American ones. The first letter I opened was from a Mrs. Joy Gresham. And though she and I had never met, and it was the first letter I'd had from her, she wrote as if she knew me. I mentioned this to Warnie, and he said, well, that's really par for the course for Americans, Jack. I said, what do you mean it's par for the course? He said, well, they give the impression that they know you. They're far too friendly. I said, Warnie, I think we English can do with a little bit of this American friendliness. He said, well, you can have my portion, Jack. Well, as I knew this conversation was clearly going nowhere, I returned to my letter, and I was very impressed with her perceptiveness and her wit. So impressed that I wrote back immediately. Not long after that, I got a letter back from her, and once again I was in awe of her perception. Well, to cut a long story short, we began a regular correspondence, and after 2 years I got a letter from her to say that she was coming to England. She had been unwell and was looking for a period of convalescence, and she had some friends in London she hadn't seen for a long time, and so she thought she'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Actually, 3 birds, because she intimated that she would like to meet with me. I mentioned this to Warnie, and I said, I think I'll invite her for lunch, Warnie. Careful, Jack, he said. I don't know what you're worried about, Warnie, I said. She won't bite. Well, then I wouldn't order much lunch if she won't bite, Jack, he said. Warnie can be very droll at times. Anyway, I did invite her for lunch, and she came up, and we had lunch in my tutorial rooms at Magdalen College. I've invited a few of my colleagues along. I was wondering how she would get on in this male bastion, but she seemed very comfortable and acquitted herself well in conversation. I wondered how she would get on being the only woman amongst a number of men, but she seemed extraordinarily uninhibited. She turned to Roger and said, is there anywhere in this monastic establishment where a lady can relieve herself? The bursar nearly laid an egg. Well, after the lunch was over, I thought I'd give her the twopenny halfpenny tour of the college. And that's what I did. And the tour went swimmingly well until we bumped into Christopher. Christopher is a bit of a cynic and has a rather jaundiced view of women. He never loses an opportunity to get a dig in when he can. Mind you, I thought even he was sailing close to the wind when he intimated that when men got together, their conversation tended to be driven by the intellect, and when women got together, their conversation tended to be driven by emotion. I shall never forget her reply. Professor Humphreys, she said, I can't do the American accent, so I won't insult you. Professor Humphreys, she said, in order to make a valued judgment about feminine conversation, you would have to experience it in an exclusive environment. To do that, you would need to change your gender. That would require you to have an operation which I, for one, would oppose on the grounds that feminine nobility would be markedly diminished. That sent him packing. Well, I put her back on the train to London with quite a bit of regret and with the hope that we would one day meet again. She went back to London, then of course back to America. But I didn't get the letter that I was expecting. And I thought, oh, that's it. Now that she's met me, the bubble has burst. Warnie was in agreement. So I don't know why you're surprised, Jack. Once you have met the object of your esteem, the fantasy element disappears, evaporates, and you are left with the reality. In your case, a rather plump, middle-aged man. Thank you, Warnie, I said. Well, a few months later, I did get a letter from her, and it became apparent why she hadn't written. She had gone back to America only to find that her husband had taken a mistress, and that mistress was now installed in the home. Of course, he was very magnanimous. He said that Joy could have the spare room if she wanted. And of course, she was very distraught. She wrote to me asking me for any advice, even though she assumed that from my writings I was against divorce. Well, I wrote back to her and said that I urged her to consider divorce only as a last resort. It wasn't so much that I was against divorce as that I am for marriage, however defective the institution might sometimes appear. She also asked whether I thought that divorce was acceptable in the eyes of God. And again, I wrote back to her and said that from my understanding of Scripture, divorce is acceptable in only one circumstance, and that of adultery. And that if her husband wouldn't give up this adulterous liaison, then I did not think that our Lord would view her seeking or getting a divorce as a sin. Though I did point out that some of his official representatives down here might take a rather less lenient view. Well, she went silent on me again. Quite a long time this time. And then the phone rang, and it was Joy. And after we exchanged a few niceties, she said, "You'll never guess, Jack." I said, "Guess what?" She said, "You'll never guess where I'm living." I said, "Don't tell me, you've moved to Narnia." "No, Jack," she said, "try London." I said, "London? London, England?" She said, "Yes, Jack, you don't object, do you?" Well, I said, "No, it's not a matter of objecting, but what about your husband?" "My ex-husband," she said. It transpired that her husband would not give up this mistress, and so she had little alternative but to file for divorce, and after she'd done that, she wanted to get her and her two boys as far away from that situation as possible. Well, I suppose 4,000 miles is a fairly safe distance. Well, now that she was ensconced in a London apartment, we struck up our correspondence again. I never visited her in London, mainly for two reasons. Firstly, I find the pace of life in our capital city very disagreeable. Secondly, Warney made it very clear that he did not think it was a good idea for a middle-aged bachelor and an Oxford don at that to be visiting a divorcee, and an American one at that. So we just continued with our correspondence. Well, I did manage in the end to persuade Warney that we should invite her and the two boys to stay with us in Oxford. Can you imagine a couple of crusted old bachelors trying to keep up with two American boys whose energy seems inexhaustible? During those few days, I took Joy on a walk through the village. And as we were going up one street, we happened to notice that there was a house up for rent. The next door neighbour happened to be in her garden, and so we asked her whether she knew what the rent was, and she said, "Well, it's about £20 a month." Well, Joy's mouth dropped open. She said, "That's half of what I'm paying in London." So I'm not surprised, Joy. London is very expensive. In fact, everything in London is expensive. Rents, food, the lot. Well, she said, "Perhaps I should move up here." I said, "Well, you'd save a lot of money." And she said, "Oh, yes, and postage." I said, "I'm not with you, Joy." She said, "Well, if I'm up here, maybe we could visit instead of write." I said, "I'm sure the neighbours will have something to say about that." Well, to cut a long story short, she did come to Headington and moved into that house. And I must say that as a short walk would have me on her doorstep, the weekly letters really became a weekly visit. Warney was unimpressed, of course. I was going out one day and he said, "You know what people are saying, don't you, Jack?" I said, "No, Warney, I don't know what they're saying because they're not saying it to me." "That doesn't mean they're not saying it, Jack." I said, "Saying what, Warney?" He said, "I don't know, they're not saying it to me either." I said, "Look, Warney, if they're not saying what they're saying to you and they're not saying what they're saying to me, how do we know what they are saying?"
He said, that's not the point, Jack. I said, it's precisely the point. Anyway, I don't see why a man can't have a lady friend. Oh, he said, Jack, lady friends are all right, but you do realize that they have other functions, don't you? I said, Warnie, without those other functions, we wouldn't be having this ridiculous conversation. I said, but now that you've mentioned it, I'll investigate the possibilities and report back to you. That soon shut him up. Well, when I was with her, the other function was never even an issue. We were generally locked in debate. She was as good a debater as any man friend I had ever had. She put me in mind of a certain Miss Anscombe, but we won't go there. Joy had a mind that was lithe and quick and muscular as a leopard. I soon learned not to talk rot to her. Well, I suppose you could say that a certain platonic status quo had settled in, and would have remained so but for an enormous brushstroke across fate's canvas. One night when I went to visit her and she opened the door, I could see she'd been crying. And she was a very independent woman, so that when she fell into my arms sobbing, I realized something was seriously wrong. And then I noticed she was clutching a letter. It was from the British government, and they had informed her that they would not renew her visa, that she and the boys should make arrangements to leave the country and go back to America, and if they didn't do that, they would be deported. Obviously, she was distraught, and she didn't want to uproot the boys and take them back to America, and she was very worried about them coming under the influence of their father. So I said, look, Joy, I'm sure we can fight this. I'll talk to my solicitor. I think you call them lawyers. I'll talk to my solicitor, I said, and let's see if we can challenge it. She said, oh, Jack, she said, I can't afford legal fees. I said, don't worry, I can cover that. She said, oh, I can't take your money, Jack. I said, I wish the tax man would take such a noble stance. Well, we tried, but we failed. The British government wouldn't budge. And I felt very sorry for her. Then one night, I was lying in bed. And I had remembered that my solicitor had said that there was one circumstance that would ensure she could stay in the country. So I had a little chat to myself. That's very dangerous. Jack, I said, you're a middle-aged man with little prospect of marriage. According to Warnie, you're a plump middle-aged man with no prospect of marriage. So it'd hardly be a sacrifice if you married her so that she could stay in the country. Well, the next night I went round to see her, and I was sitting a little nervously because I'd never done this sort of thing before. In the end, I just blurted it out. I said, marry me, Joy, and you can stay in the country. Well, there was an awkward silence, and then she said, I'm not that desperate, Jack. That was a reaction to break the tension, and we both laughed. I said to her, of course, it would be a marriage of convenience. There'd be no question of the other stuff. And she said, it's called sex, Jack. I said, I know, but I find it very hard to use that word in front of a woman. She said, oh, well, at least if I marry you, I'll be safe. Well, I said, think about it, but don't think too long. The wheels of government grind slowly, but they do grind. A few days later, she phoned me and she said, I've been thinking about your offer, Jack. It's very kind, very gracious, and I will accept. The die was cast. My only problem was telling Warnie. The day I did remains forever burnt in my memory. We were sitting in the garden. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon, and we were reading. Now, Warnie and I have known each other so long that we have managed to be able to get to the point where we can both be reading and still indulge in a shallow conversation. And such was the case that afternoon. All the while, I was trying to figure out a way how I could raise the subject, when lo and behold, he raised it himself. What's happened to the visa, Jack? Oh, I said, the British government said no. Oh, he said, I'm not surprised. Still all for the best, wagging tongues and all that. I said, Warnie, we've been here before. When's she off, Jack? I said, she's not. Well, not just yet, anyway. Oh, he said, I'm not surprised. The way the government works, take a long time, I've no doubt. Then it went silent. Thought, well, now that he's raised it, I better get it over with. Said, look, Warnie, there's something I want to tell you. Jack, he said, if you're about to tell me you're going to waste more money trying to change the British government's mind, I do not want to hear it. I said, no, Warnie, I've decided not to waste the money, waste any more money trying to change the British government's mind. Very wise, he said, Jack, very wise. I said, anyway, it's far cheaper to marry her. Well, this was a shallow conversation, as I said, and it was clear the penny had not dropped. But drop it eventually did. What? Are you serious, Jack? You're going to marry her? I said, yes, Warnie, it's the only way she can stay in the country. And don't worry, it's a marriage of convenience. Nothing's going to change. Nobody will know. Jack, he said, I can't believe it. I said, look, Warnie, you're a soldier. Look at it as a tactical maneuver to outflank the British government. Jack, he said, as an ex-soldier, what you call a tactical maneuver, we used to call a suicide mission. Well, it all went silent, and I thought, well, at least it's over with. But it wasn't. Suddenly he slammed his book shut and he said, oh, Jack, there's got to be another way. Surely there's another way. So I said, well, I suppose you could marry her, Warnie. I won't tell you what he said, but I will tell you that I was on my own in the garden for the rest of the afternoon. Well, now that that hurdle was over, the next hurdle was the marriage ceremony itself. That was in a marriage registry office in Oxford, in front of a very stern registrar. Now, I don't know what the situation is here, but if you marry in that type of place in England, it normally means there is something lurking in your past which precludes you from being married in a church. And this registrar had a very suspicious look. It's amazing how you can feel guilty for something you haven't done. Well, we muddled through, and I thought we were home free when suddenly she said something that I think we all should have anticipated. You may kiss the bride now, Mr. Lewis, if you wish. Well, Joy was horrified. Well, you'd be horrified if you had to kiss me, wouldn't you? Well, I'm referring to the ladies, of course. Warnie was in a state of apoplexy. So I said, look, would you mind if I do it later? And the registrar said, Mr. Lewis, I don't care whether you wait till doomsday. Then she signed the certificate, slapped it in my hand, and marched out of the room. Oh, I was glad to be out of that place. I went back to Magdalen. Joy went home. I think Roger took Warnie off for a stiff drink. Well, a sort of equilibrium had returned, and I still visited Joy, only a little bit more regularly, which of course irritated Warnie. I was going out one day, he said, Jack, why do you keep visiting this woman? I said, well, I am married to her, Warnie. So he said, I thought you said it was a tactical marriage. I said, well, these are only tactical visits. Well, at least he stopped talking about the neighbours. Joy made me laugh once. I was sitting with her and she started laughing. I said, why are you laughing? She said, don't you get the joke? I said, what joke? She said, well, here we are, the neighbours thinking that we're unmarried and up to all sorts of things, when all the time we're married and up to nothing at all. Our friendship continued to grow. She became as good a friend as any man friend I had. One night I praised her for her masculine virtues, but she soon put a stop to that by asking how I'd like to be praised for my feminine ones. And then there came another brushstroke. I was conducting a tutorial one morning at Magdalen, and there was a knock on the door. It was the porter. He put a little note in my hand. Mrs. Gresham has been rushed into hospital and she's asking for you. Well, as soon as I finished the tutorial, I of course went straight down to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, the receptionist said, the doctor wants to have a word with you before you go in and see Mrs. Gresham. So I said, all right. So I sat down and waited for the doctor, and he duly came with his clipboard, sat down with me, and there followed a conversation which could only have happened in a British hospital. So you're the Mr. Lewis she's been asking for, are you? I said, yes, I am. Well, he said, may I ask what relationship you are to Mrs. Gresham? I said, well, we're just good friends. Ah, he said, well, then perhaps you'll help us out. We have a few gaps in her admission form which we need to fill in. He said, could you tell me who her next of kin is? I said, well, actually I am. He said, I thought you said you were just good friends. I said, well, we are, but she's still my wife as well. I said, well, that's a rare occurrence around here. Have a wife who's a good friend. Well, he said, she gave her name as Mrs. Gresham. Should we change it to Lewis? I said, no, just think of it as her author's name. I said, well, can I have your full name? I said, yes, Clive Staples Lewis. Clive Staples Lewis. That's a coincidence, he said. I've just read a book by C.S. Lewis. You read any of his books, he said? I said, well, an Oxford Don's life is very busy. He said, well, I shouldn't worry, you haven't missed much. And then he got to the point. Sorry to tell you, Mr. Lewis, your wife is very ill. She has bone cancer. I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, it's terminal. We expect her to live weeks, maybe a few months. I said, have you told her? I said, no. We thought we would leave that to the next of kin. I said, thank you. One often reads about people being stunned when they get bad news. And one idly speculates on the absurdity of the expression. But there's truth in it. I felt I had just slipped over and hit my head on the floor. Well, I got to Joy's room, and when I went in, I was appalled. I had seen her a few days earlier, and though she did look a little off color, she still looked reasonably well. Now her face was drawn, very pale, and even though her eyes were closed, they were sunken. And obviously, she was drugged, and she was drifting in and out of sleep. So I sat there, and then she woke up for a period of time and looked at me, and she said, how long have you been here, Jack? I said, 20 minutes or so. I'm dying, aren't I, Jack? Joy, I said, everybody is dying. Don't play with me, Jack. Yes, you're dying. How long, she said. Well, the doctor says it could be weeks, perhaps months. Oh, she said. And just when I'm beginning to win all our debates. She was a heroic woman. And her main concern, of course, were for the two boys. And once I had assured her on that point, then the only other concern she had was preparing them for that fateful day. But in all this, she maintained her perspective, and she maintained her sense of humor. I remember one time I was with her, and she said, Jack, the funeral, I've got some savings that can cover that. Oh, I said, don't worry about that, Joy. Let the boys have the savings. I can cover that. Oh, I can't expect you to do that, she said. I said, why not? You are my wife. Oh, she said, that's a very good point. Oh, well, then you might as well go mad, mightn't you? And it was then that I realized I was hopelessly in love with her. I went back that day and that night I just tossed and turned in bed. I was 50-odd years old and I had never felt this way before. The next morning I cancelled my tutorials. I spruced myself up, put my best suit on, did my hair, polished my shoes, and found a tie that didn't have any stains on it. And I went to see her. When I walked into her room, she looked at me and she said, "Am I dead, Jack?" I said, "Why would you ask a question like that, Joy?" She said, "Well, looking at the way you're dressed, it looks as though you're going to a funeral." I said, "Joy, I think in the circumstances, that's a very flippant comment. Anyway," I said, "I've come to tell you I'm going to marry you." And she said, "Too late, Jack, I'm already married to some crazy Englishman." I said, "Be serious, Joy, I love you." She said, "And I love you, Jack. Have done so for some time." Well, I said, there it is then. I'm going to marry you properly, before God, in the eyes of God." "Oh," well, she said, "at least I'll be legitimate when I get up there." And then she drifted off to sleep. A few minutes later, she woke up. "Jack," she said, "do Englishmen propose?" I said, "What, as in marriage?" She said, "Yes, as in marriage." I said, "Oh, yes, they do." "Oh," she said, "must have missed it." I said, "You didn't miss it, Joy. I just told you I'm going to marry you." "Oh," she said, "that's how you do it here." She said, "In America, when a man wants to marry a girl, he asks her, he doesn't tell her." She said, "I know it's silly, but the ladies love it." I said, "All right then, Joy." So I grabbed hold of her hand and she said, "Oh no, I want the works." I said, "What do you mean by the works?" She said, "One knee, the lot." I said, "Joy, I can't get down on one knee here. Somebody might burst in." She said, "Well, if they do, count slowly to 5, say a loud amen, and get up looking pious." Well, I did get down on one knee. I got it over with as quickly as I could because I was more concerned about the door opening. And I had one eye on the door, and when I had finished my proposal, I looked back and she'd gone back to sleep. I said, "I can't believe it. She wants me to propose and can't even stay awake for the end." And then she opened one eye. And she said, "All right, Jack, I will, but we can't keep getting married." So we were married at her hospital bedside. A vicar friend of mine conducted the ceremony. And I think that day I must have been the happiest and the proudest man in all of England. Of course, I wanted to take Mrs. Lewis back to the Kilns, back here. So I asked the doctors whether she could come home. And they said, "Well, Mr. Lewis, we really can't do anything for her here, so yes, she can come home. It's as well for her to die under your roof than under this one." So Warnie and I made preparations to get her home, cleaning up, and it needed a clean up. And the night before she was due to come, Warnie said to me, "Jack," he said, "I've made arrangements for an unobtrusive withdrawal." I said, "Unobtrusive withdrawal? What do you mean?" He said, "Digs. I'm going to get digs. You know, two's company, three's a crowd." I said, "Warnie, I think you've got your arithmetic wrong. There are 2 boys, remember? That makes 4. "Oh, yes," he said. "Oh, well, that's settled then. I'll make it 5. Well, Joy did come home. And there was one more brushstroke. Remission. And it allowed us to throw ourselves into our marriage with the passion, if not the energy, of a pair of teenagers in love. In our own way, we feasted on love, every mode of it. Solemn and merry, romantic and realistic, sometimes as dramatic as a thunderstorm and sometimes as unemphatic and as comfortable as putting on your soft slippers. Years ago, when I wrote about medieval love poetry, I was blind enough to treat it as a purely literary phenomenon. I know better now. I never realized I would have in my 60s the happiness that had passed me by in my 20s. Well, as the end of the third year of remission came upon us, Joy went along for one of her usual checkups. Ironically, it was probably the only checkup that we ever approached without any dread. Her health seemed so complete. But oh, how cruel life can be. The X-ray revealed that the cancer spots had returned to the bones. It was like being recaptured by the giant after you seemed to have got through every gate and are nearly out of sight of his castle. Well, now came the waiting. And while we waited, we had to go on living. Could one ask for a second miracle? Joy grew weaker, but not so weak that she couldn't badger me to take her to Greece. And so I decided that as she had so long wanted to see the Parthenon, climb the steps of Mycenae, that we should go. And we went with two friends. And she was very resilient while we were there. I remember one night in the restaurant, she was in a very impish mood. There was an awful Greek band playing, and so she was getting little pellets of bread, rolling them in her finger and flicking them, trying to hit one of the band members. She was in good spirits when we got back. She had realized one of her greatest lifelong this worldly ambitions. The last time she was rushed into hospital, it was in great pain. But she never lost her perspective, nor her humor. Don't get me posh coffins, Jack. Posh coffins are all rot. I was with her when she died. Warnie and I were plunged into despair. Of course, Warnie had come to love her almost as much as I had, but of course in a different sort of way, seeing her as a sister we never had. He did as he had always done in a crisis. He turned to drink. I did as I had always done in a crisis. I picked up my pen and wrote. And the words were very angry to start off with. I was so angry with God. I don't think I was in any danger of ceasing to believe in him. The real danger was coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dreaded was not so there's no God after all, but so this is what God's like. I remember ranting one time to God. You led us up the garden path, didn't you? Time after time, when you seemed most gracious, you were really preparing the next torture. Of course, it was a yell. Little more than mere abuse, telling God what I thought about him. And of course, as in all abusive language, what I thought didn't really mean what I thought true. Only what I thought would offend him most. And then gradually my grief subsided. And I came to realize that I was looking at my situation from the wrong perspective. It was all about, before this, it was all about what we hadn't had rather than what we had. And I remembered that when we got married, that second time, and when she came home, we had expected to have maybe a few weeks, no more than a few months. and we had been given 3 years. And I came to see that he was the giver and she was the gift. And what a gift. She was my mother and my daughter, my pupil and my teacher, my subject and my sovereign, and always holding all these things in solution, my trusty comrade, friend, shipmate, fellow soldier. If we had never fallen in love, we should nonetheless been always together and created a scandal. I used to refer to her as a sword. Well, that's true as far as it goes, but utterly inadequate by itself and misleading. I ought to have balanced it. I ought to have said, but also like a garden, like a nest of gardens, wall within wall, hedge within hedge, more secret, more fertile, more fragrant, the further you entered. And then of her and of every created thing I praise, I should say, in some way, in its unique way, like him who made it. Thus up from the garden to the gardener, from the sword to the smith, to the life-giving life and the beauty. That makes beautiful. Do you know what I said to her near the very end? If you can, I said, if it is allowed, come to me when I too am on my deathbed. Allowed, she said. Heaven would have a job to hold me, and as for hell, I'd break it into bits. Oh, she knew she was speaking a kind of mythological language with even an element of comedy in it. There was a twinkle as well as a tear in her eye. But there was no myth, no joke, deeper than any feeling that flashed through her. Her last words to the chaplain were, I am at peace with God. Her last words to me were, you have made me very happy. And then she smiled. But she didn't smile at me. And she didn't smile at the chaplain. She had turned to the eternal fountain. And at that very moment she had entered in. And now her face shone with his reflected glory. We are all to shine like the sun. We are to be given the morning star. In one way, God has already given us the morning star. You can get up on many a fine morning and see the gift if you get up early enough. But you say, what more do we want? Well, we do want so much more. We don't merely want to see beauty, though God knows that that is bounty enough. We want something that can hardly be put into words. We want to pass into the beauty we see, become united with the beauty, receive it into ourselves. That's why the poets tell us such lovely falsehoods. They speak as if the west wind could really sweep into the human soul. But it can't. Yet, if we are to take the imagery of Scripture seriously, if we believe that God will one day give us the morning star, cause us to put on the splendor of the sun, then we may surmise that the poets, though very false as history, are very near the truth as prophecy. At the present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and the purity of the morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle as we would like with the splendors that we see. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it shall not always be so. One day, God willing, we shall enter in, and in there, in beyond nature, we shall eat of the tree of life. But the cross comes before the crown. A cleft has opened in the pitiless walls of the world, and we are invited to follow our captain inside. I suppose it may be possible to think hereafter too much of our own glory, but I do not think it is possible to think too much or too often of our neighbor's glory. It is a serious thing to remember that we live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. There are no ordinary people. You have never spoken to a mere mortal. Natures, civilizations, arts, cultures, these are mortal. Their life to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is with immortals that we work, joke, snub, marry, exploit. Oh, I do not mean to say that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play. But our merriment must be of that kind, and I think it is the best kind, which exists between people who have from the outset taken one another seriously. No presumption, no flippancy, no superiority. And our love must be a real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. Not some indulgence or mere tolerance which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. I venture to suggest that your neighbor is one of the most precious objects presented to your senses, and one of the most important. And if he or she is your Christian neighbor, they are important in another way. Because in him and in her, Christ the glorifier, glory himself, is truly hidden. And if we are not only writers and scholars, but educators, then I think we can legitimately say that our pupils are our neighbors. I can't see anything in the nature of the younger generation which stops them from accepting Christianity. If somebody is prepared to tell them, many are ready to listen. And we face a challenge to be true to our Christianity and our calling. Well, I must stop. I think it's probably accurate to say that Warnie is not going to be back in time for me to make you a cup of tea. So I'm sorry about that. But I really have enjoyed your company. If you are ever in Oxford again, and I'm still around, you are welcome to a return visit. Till that time, enjoy yourselves. Have a good journey back to America. And thank you very much for coming to see us in our home.